I already ate at school, Nia Carter said, her voice soft but steady, and she pushed the bowl of warm mac and cheese away like it didn't belong to her, like it was something dangerous, and the spoon in her hand tapped the ceramic once, twice. A faint metallic sound that hung in the quiet kitchen longer than it should have. Marcus Carter stood by the counter, still in his work boots, the scent of motor oil clinging to his jacket, watching his daughter the way a man watches something he doesn't understand but knows isn't right, because the fridge behind him was full, stocked just 2 nights ago. Milk, eggs, leftovers in neat containers, enough food to feed a family twice their size. And yet here she was, 9 years old, shoulders a little too sharp under her hoodie, eyes a little too careful, saying she wasn't hungry again. He didn't argue, didn't push, just nodded slowly and picked up her untouched bowl, the warmth still rising from it, and poured it into the trash with a quiet scrape, his jaw tightening just enough to hurt. Upstairs, the floor creaked as Nia walked to her room, each step light, practiced, like she'd learned how to move without being noticed, and Marcus stood there for a long second, staring at the empty bowl in his hands before setting it down in the sink. Later that night, the house settled into silence, the kind that presses against your ears, and Marcus sat at the small kitchen table with a lunchbox in front of him, its plastic edges worn from use, the latch slightly loose, and he opened it slowly, revealing the sandwich he'd packed that morning. Whole wheat, turkey, a slice of cheese, apple slices sealed in a bag, everything exactly as he'd left it, untouched, not even a bite taken, not even a fingerprint smudging the surface. He exhaled through his nose, long and quiet, and ran a hand over his face, the roughness of his palms scraping against stubble. Because 5 days of this wasn't a phase, it wasn't a picky appetite, it was something else. Something hidden in the hours he couldn't see. The next morning came too fast, sunlight cutting through the blinds in thin lines across the kitchen floor, and Nia sat at the table tying her sneakers. Movements precise, quick, avoiding eye contact, while Marcus moved around her, packing her lunch again. The same careful routine, but this time his hands paused just a fraction longer, his eyes flicking to the small object resting beside the bread. A tiny camera, no bigger than his thumb, black, silent, something he'd picked up from a hardware store on the edge of town, something he never thought he'd use on his own child. He didn't say anything as he slipped it into the corner of the lunchbox, tucking it beneath a folded napkin, hiding it in plain sight. And when he snapped the lid shut, the click sounded louder than it should have, sharp, final. Nia stood, slinging her backpack over her shoulder, and for a moment she looked at him, really looked, her eyes searching his face like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. And then she smiled, small and careful, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Bye, Dad," she said, and he nodded, forcing a softness into his expression that didn't match the weight building in his chest. "Have a good day, baby girl," he replied, and she turned, walking out the door into the cool morning air, the sound of it closing behind her echoing through the house. Marcus stood there long after she left, staring at that door, listening to the fading sound of her footsteps on the pavement, and something inside him tightened, a quiet, growing certainty that whatever was happening out there, in the hours between that door closing and opening again, was something his daughter had been carrying alone, something that had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with why a child would come home starving in a house that had more than enough. The house felt different after she left, quieter in a way that made every small sound sharper, and Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his phone in front of him, the screen dark, reflecting his own tired eyes back at him, because he knew the footage would not be ready yet, not until noon, not until she opened that lunchbox, and time moved slower when you were waiting for something you were not sure you wanted to see. He tried to work, tried to focus on the numbers spread across the page in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the same image, that untouched sandwich, that careful smile, the way her hands had trembled around a simple spoon, and by 11:45, he had already checked his phone 6 times, each time hoping and dreading the same thing. Then it came, a small notification, nothing dramatic, just a silent alert that the camera had captured enough footage, and his thumb hovered over the screen for a second longer than it should have before he tapped it. The video opened to a bright cafeteria, sunlight spilling across long tables, kids laughing, trays sliding, voices overlapping in a messy, ordinary rhythm. And for a moment, everything looked normal, almost reassuring, until he saw her, sitting near the end of a table, shoulders slightly hunched, lunchbox placed carefully in front of her like something fragile, something that did not belong in that room. She glanced around before opening it. Not quickly, not casually, but slowly, like she was checking if anyone was watching. And Marcus felt his chest tighten at that small, careful movement. Because children do not look over their shoulders before they eat unless they have a reason to. She lifted the lid, paused, then reached in, fingers brushing the edge of the sandwich, and for a split second, there was something like relief in her face, something soft, something that almost looked like hunger finally being allowed to exist. Then a shadow crossed the frame, and everything changed. A hand entered, pale, precise, taking the lunchbox without asking, without hesitation, and Nia froze, her fingers still curved as if they were holding something that was no longer there. The camera angle shifted slightly as the box was lifted, revealing the face of her teacher, Emily Dawson, her expression calm, composed, the kind of calm that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. She looked down at the food, then at Nia, and shook her head once, small and dismissive, like she was correcting something minor, something insignificant. "You do not need all this," she said, her tone even, almost polite, but something underneath it felt colder than the words themselves. And before Nia could respond, before she could even move, the teacher turned and emptied the contents into a nearby trash bin, the sandwich falling first, then the apple slices, disappearing out of frame like they had never been there at all. Nia did not cry, did not protest, did not even look up. She just sat there, hands now resting flat on the table, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the edge of the camera, as if she had learned that reacting only made things worse. Marcus paused the video, but his hand did not leave the phone, his breathing slower now, heavier, because that was not confusion on his daughter's face, that was recognition, like she had expected it, like this was not the first time. And when he pressed play again, what he saw next made the silence in his kitchen feel even louder, because at the edge of the frame, at another table, there was another lunchbox being taken, another child sitting just as still, just as quiet. And suddenly this was not a single moment, not a misunderstanding, but a pattern unfolding in front of him, one that had been happening while he packed lunches and believed his daughter was simply not hungry. Marcus did not move for a long time after the video ended, the phone still in his hand, the screen dimming slowly as if even the device itself could not hold that moment for too long. And the kitchen around him felt colder now, like something unseen had entered the room and settled into the walls. He replayed it once, then again, not because he needed confirmation, but because his mind refused to accept how quiet it had been, how normal it looked, how something so wrong could exist inside. Something that appeared so ordinary. The teacher's voice echoed in his head, not loud, not harsh, just calm, controlled, the kind of tone that did not invite questions, and that was what unsettled him the most, because it meant this was routine, practiced, something done without hesitation. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, pressing his fingers against his temples, trying to steady his breathing, but each replay revealed something new, something he had missed the first time. Like the way Nia had not reached for the food again, not even after it was gone. Like she already knew it would not be there. Like hope had been trained out of her in small, repeated moments. He scrubbed the video back 10 seconds, then slowed it down, watching the background this time. Not his daughter, but the edges of the frame, and that was when he saw it clearly. Another child at a nearby table, another lunchbox being lifted, another small body going still in the exact same way, shoulders tightening, hands flattening against the surface, silence replacing whatever had been there before. Marcus straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening as a different kind of understanding settled in, heavier, sharper, because this was not about one teacher having a bad day. This was not a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was a pattern, deliberate and repeated, something that required time to form, something that had been allowed to continue. He set the phone down slowly, then picked it up again almost immediately, his fingers moving faster now, scrolling through the footage, jumping between timestamps, searching for more, and each clip only confirmed what he already feared, different angles, different moments, but the same outcome, the same quiet removal, the same absence of protest, like the children had learned that speaking would not change anything. Outside, a car passed, tires humming against the pavement, the ordinary world continuing without pause. And Marcus felt a sharp contrast between that normalcy and what he had just witnessed, like two realities existing side by side, one visible, one hidden. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, the sound loud in the empty house, and paced once across the kitchen, then back again, his hands opening and closing at his sides as if he needed to release something he could not name. Anger flickered, quick and hot, but it did not stay, because beneath it was something steadier, something more focused. A realization that reacting without thinking would not protect his daughter, would not change what had already been happening. He stopped near the counter, looking at the closed lunchbox sitting there, the same one he had packed with care, the same one that had become a container not just for food, but for something far more serious, something that had been taken from his child piece by piece. He exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders to relax, forcing his thoughts into order, because this was no longer about guessing or hoping. This was about knowing, and knowing meant he had a choice to make, not just as a father, but as someone who had just seen a truth that was never meant to be seen. And as the clock on the wall ticked steadily toward the afternoon, one thing became clear to him with a quiet certainty. He could not walk into that school blindly. Not anymore. Not after what the camera had shown him. Because whatever was happening inside those walls was deeper than a single moment. And if he wanted to protect his daughter, he would have to understand just how far it went. Marcus did not go back to the table, did not sit, did not turn the television on like he usually did in the afternoon. Instead, he stood by the kitchen window with his phone in his hand, replaying the footage in silence as the sunlight shifted slowly across the floor, because each time he watched it, something new surfaced, something smaller but sharper, like the way the other children did not react either. Like they had all learned the same rule without ever speaking it out loud. He paused, again on a frame where Nia sat perfectly still, her hands flat, her shoulders pulled inward, and there was something about that posture that unsettled him more than anything else, because it was not fear in the way people imagined fear. It was something quieter, something practiced, like she had been taught that the safest way to exist was to take up as little space as possible. His grip tightened around the phone, then loosened, because reacting too quickly would not help her, not now, not. When this had clearly been happening for longer than a few days, he moved back to the table and sat down slowly, the chair legs scraping lightly against the tile, and began organizing the clips, trimming them, saving copies, his movements careful and deliberate, like he was handling something fragile that could break if he rushed it. Minutes turned into nearly an hour, and the more he watched, the clearer. The pattern became the same teacher, the same calm voice, the same quiet removal, and never once did anyone else step in, not another adult, not a staff member, not even a glance from across the room, which meant one thing that sat heavy in his chest. This was not hidden as well as it should have been. It was simply ignored. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second marking the space between what he knew now and what he would have to do next. And when it finally reached the time Nia's bus would pull up, he locked the phone and set it down, forcing his expression to settle into something softer, something she would not question. The front door opened with a familiar creak, and her footsteps came in light and measured, backpack sliding off her shoulder onto the floor with a quiet thud. And when she stepped into the kitchen, Marcus turned toward her with a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "Hey, baby girl," he said gently, and she nodded, offering that same careful smile. In return, the one that felt more like a shield than an expression. "How was school?" he asked, keeping his voice even, steady, and she shrugged slightly, eyes drifting toward the counter instead of meeting his. "It was okay," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her answer, no sign that anything unusual had happened, because for her, it was not unusual anymore. Marcus studied her for a moment, noticing how her gaze avoided the fridge, how her hands stayed close to her sides, how her body moved with a quiet restraint that no child should carry, and he felt that same tightness in his chest return, sharper now, because the footage had shown him what happened, but this was showing him what it was doing to her. He stepped aside and opened the fridge, pulling out a plate and setting it gently on the counter, not forcing, not pushing, just offering. and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before walking over. Her movements slow, cautious, like she was unsure if this was allowed, and that hesitation told him everything he needed to know without a single word being spoken. He turned away slightly, giving her space, pretending to busy himself with the sink, but his eyes stayed on her reflection in the window, watching as she reached for the food, paused, then finally took a small bite. And the moment she did, something shifted in her shoulders, something almost invisible, but real enough for him to feel it, like a weight had lifted just a little. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose, because that small moment confirmed what the camera could not fully capture. This was not just about food being taken, it was about something deeper being denied, something that had made his daughter question whether she was even allowed to be hungry. And as the sound of her quiet chewing filled the space behind him, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever was happening inside that school was not going to stop on its own. And if he wanted to protect her, he would have to step into it, carefully, deliberately, and without giving anyone the chance to hide it again. Marcus did not bring it up that night, not at dinner, not when Nia sat across from him eating slowly, carefully, like each bite required permission, and not when she quietly said she was full after only a few minutes, even though he could see the way her eyes lingered on the plate before she pushed it away. He simply nodded and let her leave the table, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. And only when her bedroom door clicked shut did he allow his expression to change, the calm, slipping into something more focused, more deliberate. He moved back to the kitchen table, pulled his phone toward him, and reopened the footage, not to relive it, but to study it, to understand every detail that could matter, because walking in without proof would only give them time to deny, to explain it away, to make him sound like he was overreacting. He replayed the moment again, watching the teacher's movements, the angle of her body, the way she positioned herself between the child and the rest of the room, subtle, controlled, almost strategic. And then he noticed something else, something he had missed before, a small glance she gave across the cafeteria, not toward the students, but toward the far end where another adult stood, a staff member near the serving line. And for a brief second, their eyes met, and neither of them reacted, not surprise, not concern, just a silent acknowledgement before both returned to what they were doing. Marcus leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath him, because that single glance carried more weight than anything else he had seen. It meant this was not hidden, not entirely. It existed in plain sight, supported by silence. He paused the video on that exact frame, zoomed in slightly, studying the other adult's face, trying to fix it in his memory, because if this went further, if it needed to, details like that would matter. The house remained still around him, the hum of the refrigerator the only constant sound, and he became aware of how alone this moment felt, how heavy the responsibility was now that he knew. Because once you see something like that, you cannot pretend it does not exist. He reached for a notepad and began writing. Not names, not accusations, just observations, timestamps, small pieces of a larger pattern, organizing it in a way that made sense, because emotion alone would not be enough, not in a place that valued appearance over truth. Upstairs, a faint sound came from Nia's room, the soft shift of movement, and Marcus paused, listening, his grip tightening slightly on the pen, because even now, even with everything he had seen, his first instinct was still to protect her from knowing how much he knew, to let her have at least one space where she did not feel watched or measured. He set the pen down and walked quietly down the hallway, stopping just outside her door, not opening it, just standing there for a second, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing, steady, calm, the kind of sound that should have brought him peace, but instead reminded him how much she had been holding in during the day. He returned to the kitchen and looked once more at the phone screen, at the frozen image of that moment, and something inside him settled, not anger, not fear, but a clear decision forming with quiet certainty, because this was no longer just about noticing or understanding, it was about what came next. And as he turned off the light and the kitchen fell into darkness, the only thing left visible was the faint glow of the screen, still paused on that frame, still holding the truth he now carried. And he knew that tomorrow, he would not just watch anymore, he would step into it, but he would do it in a way they would not expect, in a way that would make it impossible for them to look away. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made long before the sun rises, and Marcus moved through the kitchen with steady hands, preparing Nia's lunch the same way he always did, same sandwich, same apple slices, same careful placement. But this time there was something different in the way he watched each step, like every motion carried weight beyond routine. Nia sat at the table, tying her shoes again, her movements just as precise, just as contained, and when she glanced up at him, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something searching, like she was trying to read a change she could not quite name. He gave her a soft smile, one that held steady even though his thoughts were anything but, and closed the lunchbox with a quiet click that seemed louder in the stillness. "You ready?" he asked gently, and she nodded, standing, pulling her backpack over her shoulder, her posture small but composed. The walk to the bus stop was short, just a few houses down, the pavement cool under their feet, and neither of them spoke much, the silence not uncomfortable, but full, like something unspoken existed between them now. When the bus arrived, its brakes releasing a soft hiss, Nia stepped up without hesitation, turning back only once to give a small wave, and Marcus raised his hand in return, holding that gesture a second longer than usual before letting it fall. He did not go back inside right away. Instead, he stood there until the bus disappeared around the corner, until the street returned to its ordinary quiet. And then he turned, not toward the house, but toward his car. The drive to the school took just under 15 minutes. Traffic light, the radio off, the only sound the steady hum of the engine, and Marcus kept his eyes forward, his mind focused not on what he felt, but on what he needed to do. When the school came into view, it looked exactly the same as it always had, clean brick walls, trimmed lawns, a place that promised structure and safety, and that contrast settled heavily in his chest as he pulled into the parking lot. He did not rush out of the car. Instead, he sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing and slowly, grounding himself. Because walking in with anger would close doors before they even opened, he stepped out finally, closing the door with a controlled motion, and made his way toward the main entrance, each step measured, deliberate, his gaze taking in the details, the parents dropping off younger children, the staff members greeting students, everything appearing normal, routine, untouched by what he knew existed just beyond the surface. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and polished floors, lockers lining the walls, students moving in clusters, voices echoing lightly, and Marcus walked past them all with a quiet focus, heading toward the front office. The receptionist looked up as he approached, her smile automatic, practiced, and he returned it with a calm nod. "Good morning," she said, and he matched her tone, steady and polite. "Good morning. I would like to speak with Principal Cole when he is available." And there was nothing in his voice that hinted at what he carried, nothing that suggested urgency or accusation, just a simple request. She typed briefly on her computer, then nodded. "He has a few minutes before his next meeting," and gestured toward a hallway, and Marcus thanked her, turning in the direction she indicated, his footsteps quiet against the floor. As he walked, he passed the cafeteria doors, slightly open, the faint sound of trays and voices drifting through, and for a brief second, he slowed, his eyes shifting toward the gap, but he did not stop, because he already knew what he would find inside, and this was not the moment for that. Instead, he continued down the hallway until he reached the office door, the nameplate reading Richard Cole in clean lettering, and he paused there, his hand hovering just inches from the handle, because this was the line between knowing and confronting, between observing and acting. He exhaled once, steady and controlled, then reached forward and knocked, not loud, not forceful, just enough to be heard. And as he waited for the response from inside, the quiet certainty that had been building since the night before settled fully into place, because whatever happened next, he was no longer just watching from a distance. He was stepping directly into the space where the truth had been allowed to exist, unnoticed, and he intended to make sure it did not stay that way. "Come in," a voice called from inside, calm, measured, and Marcus pushed the door open slowly, stepping into an office that felt almost too orderly, shelves lined with awards, framed certificates reflecting the morning light, everything arranged with precision that suggested control rather than comfort. Principal Richard Cole sat behind a wide desk, his posture straight, his expression neutral but attentive. The kind of expression that had likely handled hundreds of conversations just like this, though none quite like the one Marcus carried with him. "Mr. Carter, right," Cole said, rising slightly from his chair in a polite acknowledgement, and Marcus nodded, extending a hand, his grip firm but controlled. "Yes, sir. Thank you for seeing me," he replied, his tone even, giving nothing away. Cole gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course, please, have a seat. What can I help you with today?" And Marcus sat, placing his phone face down on the desk, not yet introducing it into the conversation, because timing mattered more than urgency. "I wanted to talk about something I have noticed with my daughter," Marcus began, his voice steady, measured, each word placed carefully, and Cole leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, listening in the way someone listens when they expect a minor concern, something routine. "She has been coming home hungry," Marcus continued, "not just skipping meals, but avoiding food entirely, and that is not normal for her." And Cole nodded. Slowly, the movement practiced, sympathetic without being fully engaged. "Children go through phases sometimes," he said gently. "Changes in appetite, stress, it can happen." And Marcus watched him closely, noting the ease of that response, the way it redirected without addressing anything directly. "I thought that too at first," Marcus replied, maintaining the same calm tone. "But I wanted to understand what was happening during the day, so I took a closer look." And at that, something subtle shifted in Cole's posture. Not alarm, not yet, but a slight tightening around the eyes, a quiet awareness that the conversation might not stay in familiar territory. Marcus reached forward then, turning his phone over and unlocking it with a steady motion, the screen lighting up between them, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough to carry weight. "I would like you to see something," Marcus said, not raising his voice, not accusing, just presenting, and he tapped the screen, bringing up the paused frame from the cafeteria, the image frozen at the moment before everything changed. Cole leaned forward slightly, his gaze dropping to the screen, and Marcus pressed play, letting the footage speak without interruption. The room filled with the faint sounds of the cafeteria, distant voices, the clatter of trays, and then the moment unfolded exactly as it had before. Nia opening her lunch, the teacher stepping in, the quiet removal, the food disappearing into the trash, the stillness that followed. Marcus did not look at the screen. He looked at Cole, watching for the reaction. The shift, the acknowledgement that could not be hidden, and for a brief moment, there it was, a flicker, small but unmistakable, before Cole's expression settled back into something controlled. The video ended, and the office returned to silence, heavier now, more defined, and Cole exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his fingers pressing together as if organizing his thoughts. "I see," he said finally, his voice calm, but different now, more careful. "That is concerning." And Marcus nodded once, not filling the silence, not rushing the moment, because this was where truth either surfaced or disappeared. "This is not an isolated incident," Marcus added quietly, his hand resting near the phone but not touching it. "There are multiple recordings, multiple children." And the words hung in the air, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Cole's gaze shifted briefly to the side, then back, and in that small movement, Marcus saw something deeper than surprise, something closer to recognition. Like this was not entirely new information, just newly undeniable. And that realization settled into Marcus with a quiet weight, because it meant the line he had stepped across was not just between ignorance and awareness, but between silence and accountability. And as the clock ticked softly on the wall behind them, the space between the two men felt less like a conversation and more like a moment where something long hidden had finally been placed in plain sight, waiting to see who would acknowledge it first. Principal Cole did not speak immediately after Marcus finished, and that silence stretched longer than it should have, not empty, but calculated, like he was choosing which version of the truth he was willing to acknowledge. His fingers remained pressed together, elbows resting lightly on the desk, posture controlled, composed, but his eyes no longer held that same effortless calm. There was a tension now, subtle but present, something that had not been there before the video played. "I will need to review this more carefully," he said finally, his voice measured, careful with each word, and Marcus nodded once, not interrupting, not challenging, because he understood that this moment was not about pushing. It was about watching what the man in front of him chose to do with what he had seen. Cole reached forward slightly, his gaze returning briefly to the phone as if confirming what could no longer be denied, then leaned back again, exhaling through his nose in a controlled breath. "This is concerning," he repeated, but the word felt thinner now, less like a reaction and more like a placeholder, something to fill the space without fully stepping into it. Marcus remained still, his hands resting calmly on his lap, his posture steady, because the absence of a stronger response spoke louder than any denial could have. "I would like to understand how long this has been happening," Marcus said quietly, his tone unchanged, not accusing, but direct, and Cole's eyes flicked up to meet his, just for a moment, before shifting slightly to the side again, a small movement that carried more meaning than his words. "I cannot say for certain," Cole replied, and there was a pause before he added, "but I will look into it immediately." And that hesitation, that slight delay, settled into Marcus with a quiet clarity, because it was not uncertainty he was hearing. It was restraint. Marcus leaned forward just slightly, enough to bring himself closer to the edge of the desk, not invading space, but closing the distance just enough to signal that this was not a casual conversation. "There are multiple recordings," he said again, softer this time, almost like a reminder. "Different days, different children." And the repetition was not for emphasis, it was for grounding, anchoring the truth in something that could not be minimized. Cole nodded once, slower. Now, his expression tightening at the edges, the composure still intact but no longer effortless. "I understand," he said, and for the first time, there was a trace of something else in his voice, something closer to pressure, as if the weight of the situation had finally reached him. The office felt smaller now, the air heavier, the ticking clock behind Cole's desk louder than before, marking each second with a quiet insistence that time was moving forward whether they acknowledged it or not. Marcus did not rush to fill the silence that followed. He allowed it to sit, because sometimes silence forced a person to reveal more than questions ever could. After a moment, Cole shifted in his chair, his gaze moving briefly toward the door, then back again, and that small glance did not go unnoticed. "I will speak with the staff involved," Cole said, his tone firming slightly, as if reclaiming authority, "and we will address this appropriately." And the phrasing was careful, structured, but it lacked something Marcus had expected, something like urgency, something like accountability. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression unchanged, but inside, the realization settled deeper, because this was not resistance, not outright denial. It was something more complex, something quieter, like a system that had learned how to respond without truly confronting itself. He reached forward then and locked his phone, the screen going dark between them, and for a brief moment, the reflection in that black surface showed both of them sitting across from each other, one holding the evidence, the other holding the position. Marcus stood, his movements controlled, deliberate, and Cole followed, rising from his chair as well, their eye contact holding for a second longer than before. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," Cole said, his voice steady, and Marcus gave a small nod, not acknowledging the words, but the moment itself, because what had just happened was not resolution, not even close. It was only the beginning of something that had already gone on for too long. As Marcus turned toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle, he paused just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to mark the shift inside him, because whatever assurance had been offered in that room did not match what he had seen on that screen. And as he stepped out into the hallway, the sounds of the school returning around him, one thought remained clear. If the truth had been this easy to show, then the response to it should not have been this careful, and that meant there was still more beneath the surface, something not yet said, something not yet revealed, and he was no longer willing to leave it there. Marcus did not leave the building right away. Even after stepping out of the office and into the hallway where everything looked the same as it had before, students moving between classes, lockers closing with soft metallic clicks, voices rising and falling in casual conversation, because the normalcy of it all pressed against him in a way that felt almost unreal. He walked slowly, not toward the exit, but back in the direction of the cafeteria, his steps measured, his expression neutral, blending into the flow of parents and staff who passed through these halls without question. The doors to the cafeteria were open now, wider than before, and he paused just outside. For a second, listening, the sound of trays sliding across counters, the low hum of conversation, nothing out of place, nothing that would ever suggest what he had already seen. Then he stepped inside. The space was bright, filled with movement, students seated in clusters, some laughing, some quiet. The routine of lunch unfolding in plain sight, and Marcus kept his gaze steady, not searching too obviously, just observing, letting his eyes move naturally across the room. It did not take long. Near the center tables, he saw her, Emily Dawson, standing beside a group of students, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, speaking softly to one child while adjusting something on another's tray, the image of attentiveness, of care, exactly what anyone would expect from a teacher. Marcus slowed his pace slightly, his attention sharpening, because this was the same person from the footage, the same calm presence, the same controlled movements. But here, in the open, there was nothing that looked out of place, nothing that would raise concern to anyone who did not already know what to look for. He moved along the perimeter, passing by tables, keeping enough distance to avoid drawing attention, but close enough to see the details, the small interactions, the moments between moments. At one table, a student laughed, pushing a carton of milk toward a friend. At another, a teacher leaned down to speak to a child at eye level, everything appearing exactly as it should. Then he saw it again, not identical, not as obvious, but enough. A lunchbox opened, a brief exchange, a quiet gesture, and the food was moved aside, not taken this time, just repositioned, set further from reach, accompanied by a soft instruction he could not fully hear, but the body language said enough. The slight hesitation from the child, the compliance that followed. Marcus stopped near a column, his hands at his sides, his gaze steady, because now that he had seen it once, he could see the pattern even in its smallest form, the way certain children were approached, the way others were left alone, the subtle difference in tone, in distance, in control. Across the room, Emily Dawson moved again, her attention shifting from one table to another, and for a brief moment, her eyes lifted, scanning the space, and they passed over Marcus without recognition, without pause, because to her, he was just another adult in the room, just another presence that did not disrupt the routine. Marcus held that moment, that invisibility, because it allowed him to see without interference, to witness without altering what was happening. And what he saw was not chaos, not something loud or aggressive, but something quieter, something woven into the rhythm of the room so seamlessly that it became part of the background. A system did not need to shout to exist, it only needed to be repeated. After a few more minutes, Marcus turned away, walking back toward the doors, his pace unchanged, his expression still calm, because there was no confrontation here, not yet. This was observation, confirmation. The final piece that aligned what he had seen on the screen with what existed in real time. As he stepped back into the hallway, the noise of the cafeteria softened behind him, replaced by the quieter sounds of the corridor, and he exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in clarity, because what he had just witnessed removed any remaining doubt. This was not an isolated act, not a single moment caught on camera. It was a pattern embedded into the day, subtle enough to avoid attention, consistent enough to shape behavior. He reached for his phone, not to record, not now, but to feel its presence. The evidence already secured inside it, and as he walked toward the exit, one thought settled firmly into place. If something like this could exist so openly without being questioned, then bringing it to light would require more than a single conversation. It would require making it impossible to ignore, and Marcus was no longer thinking about whether he should act, only about how far he would need to go to make sure this ended. Marcus stepped out into the parking lot and closed his car door with a quiet click, but he did not start the engine right away. Instead, he sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead, replaying everything he had just seen not as separate moments, but as a single, continuous pattern that stretched far beyond one classroom or one teacher. The sunlight reflected faintly off the windshield, casting a soft glare across his face, but he did not move, because now the question was no longer whether something was wrong. It was how deeply it was rooted and how carefully it had been allowed to continue. He reached for his phone again, unlocking it with a steady motion, and began organizing the footage with a different kind of precision. Now, not just saving clips, but arranging them in sequence, labeling times, matching faces, building something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. Each clip added weight, not just to the evidence, but to the realization that this was not impulsive behavior. It was structured, repeated, normalized within the environment, subtle enough to avoid confrontation, consistent enough to shape behavior over time. His jaw tightened slightly as he paused on a frame where Nia sat still after her food was removed, her hands resting flat, her eyes lowered, and he zoomed in just enough to see the expression more clearly. Not sadness, not confusion, but something quieter, something that looked like acceptance, and that was what stayed with him the longest, because acceptance meant this had been happening long enough to change how she saw herself. He locked the phone again and leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly, because acting too soon, too loudly, would give them space to deny, to minimize, to protect the structure that allowed this to exist. He needed more than truth. He needed it seen, undeniable, shared in a way that could not be quietly redirected. His gaze shifted toward the school building once more, the brick walls standing still under the afternoon light, unchanged, unaffected, and that contrast settled into him again, the difference between what was visible and what was real. He started the car then, the engine turning over with a low hum, and pulled out of the parking space with controlled movements, his mind already moving ahead to the next step, not reaction, but strategy. The drive home felt shorter this time, not because the distance had changed, but because his focus had sharpened, every thought aligning toward one outcome, one direction, one purpose. When he stepped inside the house, the silence greeted him again, familiar now, but no longer passive, and he moved directly to the kitchen table, placing his phone down and opening a notebook beside it, flipping to a clean page. He began writing again, not just observations now, but connections, timelines, questions that needed answers, and names that needed to be verified. His handwriting steady, deliberate, because clarity would matter more than emotion when this moved beyond that office. Hours passed without him noticing, the light outside shifting gradually from afternoon to early evening, shadows stretching across the floor, and still he worked, building something that felt less like notes and more like a case, something structured, something that could hold its ground when challenged. When the front door finally opened and Nia stepped inside, her footsteps soft. As always, Marcus looked up immediately, closing the notebook without hesitation, because this moment, was not for her to carry. "Hey," he said gently, and she gave that same small nod, that same careful smile, setting her backpack down near the door. "Hey, Dad," she replied, her voice light, controlled, as if nothing had changed. Marcus watched her for a second longer than usual, taking in the way she moved, the way she avoided looking directly at the table, the fridge, anything that suggested food without permission, and something inside him tightened again, but he did not show it. Not here, not now. Instead, he stepped aside and reached for a plate, placing it on the counter quietly, not insisting, just offering the space, the option, and she paused, just for a moment, before walking over, her movements cautious but slightly less restrained than the day before. Marcus turned away again, giving her that same privacy, that same distance, but this time, his eyes shifted toward the notebook he had just closed, the edge of the page still visible, filled with details that no longer felt separate from the moment unfolding behind him. As the quiet sound of her taking a bite reached him, soft but real, Marcus exhaled slowly, because everything he had seen, everything he had gathered, was no longer just evidence of a problem. It was a measure of what had been taken from her, and what he now had to make right, not just for her, but for every child who had learned to sit still, to say nothing, and to believe that even hunger needed permission. That night, Marcus did not open the notebook again right away, not while Nia was still awake, not while the soft sounds of her moving around upstairs reminded him that she was still just a child trying to make sense of a world that had quietly taught her to shrink. Instead, he sat at the edge of the living room couch, the television on but muted, the flickering light casting slow shadows across the walls. his eyes unfocused as his thoughts moved ahead of him, not in anger, not in panic, but in something steadier, something that required patience. When he finally heard her bedroom door close and the house settled into that familiar nighttime stillness, he stood and walked back to the kitchen. The same table, the same chair, the same phone waiting where he had left it, but everything about the moment felt heavier now, more defined, because what he was about to do was no longer just gathering information. It was preparing to bring something into the open that had been allowed to stay hidden. He opened the notebook again, flipping past the pages already filled with notes, and began writing with a different kind of focus, not just what he had seen, but how it connected, the patterns, the repetition, the way certain children were approached while others were not, the way silence seemed to follow those interactions, and as he wrote, the pieces aligned more clearly, forming something that no longer felt like scattered observations, but like a system that had learned how to operate without drawing attention. He paused once, his pen hovering above the page, as a memory surfaced, something small but significant, the way Principal Cole had looked away for just a second too long, the way his response had been careful rather than immediate, and Marcus wrote that down too, not as an accusation, but as part of the pattern, because hesitation in the face of truth was its own kind of answer. He reached for his phone then and began selecting the clearest clips, trimming them with precision, removing anything unnecessary, leaving only the moments that spoke for themselves, the quiet removal of food, the stillness that followed, the repetition across different days, different children, and as he worked, he organized them into a sequence that built understanding without explanation, because sometimes the truth was strongest when it was simply shown, not argued. The clock on the wall moved past 10, then 11. The house remaining silent except for the faint sound of his pen against paper and the occasional tap of his finger on the screen, and still he continued, not rushing, not skipping steps, because he understood that what he was building needed to hold under scrutiny, needed to stand on its own without him having to defend it. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Briefly, letting the weight of it settle, not the footage, not the system, but what it had done to Nia, the way she had learned to hesitate before eating, the way she had begun to treat something as basic as hunger like a question instead of a need. And that thought stayed with him longer than anything else, grounding everything he was doing in something real, something personal. When he opened his eyes again, the decision that had been forming all day felt complete, clear in a way that left no room for doubt, because this was not something that could be handled quietly behind closed doors, not when it had been allowed to exist so openly for so long. He closed the notebook slowly, his hand resting on the cover for a second before sliding it aside, and looked down at his phone, at the sequence of clips now arranged with purpose, ready to be seen not just by one person, but by anyone who needed to understand what had been happening. The kitchen light hummed softly above him, the rest of the house still, and Marcus sat there for a moment longer, not moving, not speaking, just breathing in the quiet certainty that tomorrow would not be the same as today, because the line between knowing and acting had already been crossed, and this time, there would be no room left for silence to protect what should have never been allowed to continue. The next morning did not feel like the others, not because anything looked different on the surface, but because Marcus moved through it with a quiet certainty that had replaced hesitation, and as he packed Nia's lunch, the same careful routine now carried a different weight, each item placed not just with care, but with purpose, like this simple act had become part of something larger than either of them had spoken aloud. Nia sat at the table again, tying her shoes, her movements still precise, still controlled, but when she glanced up at him this time, there was a brief pause in her expression, something softer, something less guarded, like the small changes from the night before had not gone unnoticed. Marcus met her gaze with a steady warmth, not forcing anything, not asking questions, just holding the space long enough for her to feel it. And then he closed the lunchbox with that same quiet click, but this time, there was no hidden camera inside, no need for it anymore, because what he needed had already been captured. The walk to the bus stop felt lighter in the air, but heavier in meaning. And when the bus pulled up, Nia stepped on with that same small wave, but her shoulders seemed just slightly less tense, a shift so subtle it could have been missed by anyone not paying attention. But Marcus noticed it, held on to it, because even the smallest change mattered now. He watched the bus disappear again, but this time, he did not stand there long. He turned immediately, heading back to his car with a clear direction in mind. The drive was quiet, focused, his phone resting on the passenger seat, the compiled footage ready, the notes organized, everything aligned for what needed to happen next. When he arrived at the school, the scene was the same, students arriving, staff greeting them, the routine continuing as if nothing had changed. But Marcus knew better, and that knowledge guided every step he took as he walked through the entrance once more. This time, he did not stop at the front desk, did not ask for permission, because he had already done that, already seen how far that path would go. Instead, he moved with quiet confidence toward the administrative wing, the sound of his footsteps steady against the polished floor. The door to the conference room was partially open, voices inside low but present, and Marcus paused for only a second before pushing it open and stepping inside. Several staff members sat around the table, including Principal Cole and Emily Dawson, their conversation stopping immediately as they turned toward him, surprise flickering across their faces, quickly replaced by composed expressions. Marcus did not raise his voice, did not rush. He simply walked to the front of the room and placed his phone on the table, screen facing them, his posture straight, his presence calm but unyielding. "I believe this concerns more than a private conversation," he said, his tone even, controlled. And before anyone could respond, he tapped the screen, letting the footage play. Again, not just one clip this time, but the full sequence he had arranged, each moment following the last, building a picture that required no explanation. The room grew still, the quiet not empty but heavy, each second of video filling the space with something that could no longer be softened or redirected, and Marcus stood there without speaking, allowing the truth to occupy the room in a way words never could. He watched their faces instead, the subtle shifts, the tightening expressions, the glances exchanged between staff members, the moment when denial became impossible and silence became something else entirely. When the final clip ended, the screen dimmed slightly, but no one moved right away. And in that pause, Marcus felt the difference, not resolution, not yet, but a break in the pattern, a disruption that could not be easily undone. He did not push further, did not add more, because everything that needed to be said had already been shown. And as he stood there, waiting, one thing was clear in the stillness that followed. This was no longer something that could be contained within quiet conversations or careful responses. It had crossed into the open, and what happened next would not just define the people in that room, but whether the silence that had allowed it to exist would finally come to an end. No one spoke for several seconds after the screen went dark, and that silence felt different now, not careful, not controlled, but heavy, like something had finally settled into the room with enough weight that it could not be moved aside. Marcus stood still, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, his posture steady, not confrontational, just present, and across from him, Principal Cole exhaled slowly. The composure he had held before now showing small fractures, subtle but real. Emily Dawson remained seated, her shoulders squared, her expression tight, eyes no longer moving as freely as before, fixed somewhere between the phone and the table, like she was searching for a version of the moment that had not just played out. One of the staff members shifted in their chair, the sound small but loud in the stillness, and then another voice finally broke through, quieter than expected, uncertain. This needs to be addressed immediately. And it did not come from Marcus. It came from within the room, from someone who had just seen what could no longer be unseen. Cole nodded slowly. But this time, the movement carried more weight, less distance, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, not entirely, but enough to be noticed. "We will be conducting a full review," he said, and the words no longer felt like placeholders. They felt like something that had been forced into motion. Marcus did not respond right away, because this moment was not about hearing promises. It was about seeing the shift, and he watched carefully as the room adjusted around the truth, as the quiet acceptance of what had been allowed to continue gave way to something less comfortable, something that required action. He reached forward and picked up his phone, the screen still dark, the evidence now no longer hidden inside it, but reflected in the faces around the table, and without another word, he stepped back, giving the space room to respond without his presence shaping it. Further, no one stopped him as he turned toward the door. No one tried to redirect or soften what had just happened, because that option had passed the moment the footage began. The hallway outside felt different this time, not quieter, but clearer, the sounds of the school no longer masking what existed within it. And Marcus walked through it with the same steady pace, not rushing, not looking back, because what needed to happen next was no longer in that room alone. When he stepped outside, the air felt cooler, the sky open above him, and he paused for just a second beside his car, his hand resting against the door, his breath steady, not in relief, but in recognition that something had shifted, not everything, not yet, but enough to begin. Later that afternoon, the front door opened again, and Nia stepped inside, her movements familiar, her presence quiet, but no longer as tightly held, and Marcus looked up from the kitchen, meeting her with that same steady warmth. She hesitated for a moment, just a second, then walked toward the counter where a plate already waited, and this time, she did not pause as long, did not look around before reaching for it. She simply took a bite, small, but certain. Marcus did not say anything, did not move closer. He just stood there, watching without watching, giving her that space, that normalcy. And as the light from the window fell softly across the kitchen, something shifted again, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet return to something that should have never been questioned in the first place. Nia sat down slowly, continuing to eat, each bite a little less hesitant than the last, and Marcus turned slightly toward the sink, his hands resting against the counter, his gaze lowered, because this moment was not about what had been exposed. It was about what was being restored, piece by piece, in the smallest, most human way. The house remained quiet, the sound of a fork against a plate soft and steady, and in that stillness, there was no need for words, no need for explanations, because sometimes change does not arrive all at once. Sometimes it begins with something as simple as a child no longer asking permission to be hungry, and a father who refused to let silence decide what she deserved.